Sometimes the wounds we carry are deeper than the ones we show. For 34-year-old Cole Merrick, the hardest battle wasn't in Afghanistan. It was learning to ask for help. 3 years after an IED blast left him with what seemed like minor leg pain, Cole pushed through every day as a tactical trainer. He was tough. He was fine. He didn't need anyone worrying about him. But when Cole collapsed during a routine drill, doctors found something that shocked his entire unit. A live piece of military shrapnel had been slowly moving through his leg for years, dangerously close to his main artery. His Army brothers rushed to the hospital, stunned by what their friend had been hiding. As bomb experts were called in and surgeons prepared for emergency surgery, Cole faced his biggest fear showing weakness. What would it cost him to finally let down his guard and trust others to help him heal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Colorado training facility as Cole Merrick adjusted his stance, watching a group of new recruits struggle through basic tactical maneuvers. His weathered hands gripped the clipboard a little tighter than necessary, compensating for the persistent ache that traveled from his left knee up through his thigh. 3 years had passed since Afghanistan, but some mornings felt like yesterday. "Keep your weapon-ready position higher, Martinez," Cole called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had earned respect the hard way. "In the field, hesitation gets you and your team killed." The 22-year-old recruit nodded eagerly, adjusting his grip on the training rifle. Cole recognized that look, the mixture of determination and fear that every soldier wore when they realized training might be the difference between coming home and not. He had worn that same expression once, back when the world seemed simpler and courage meant charging forward without question. Sarah Chun, the facility's medic and Cole's closest colleague, approached from across the dusty training ground. Her observant eyes caught the way he shifted his weight, favoring his right leg. She had been a Navy corpsman before joining the private training facility, and her instincts for spotting hidden injuries remained sharp. "You're limping again," she said quietly, falling into step beside him as they watched the recruits navigate the obstacle course. "Just stiff from the morning run," Cole replied. The same response he had given her dozens of times over the past year. "Nothing a hot shower won't fix." Sarah studied his profile, noting the tension lines around his eyes that seemed deeper lately. "When was your last full medical checkup? Not the cursory stuff for work, but a real examination." Cole's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm fine, Sarah. Focus on the recruits who actually need medical attention." But Sarah had seen enough wounded warriors to recognize the signs. The way Cole unconsciously rubbed his left thigh when he thought no one was looking. The careful way he positioned himself to avoid putting full weight on that leg during demonstrations. The barely concealed grimace when he had to kneel or change positions quickly in his small apartment that evening. Cole sat at his kitchen table with a leather-bound journal spread open before him. The pages contained tactical notes, sketches of IED locations from his tours, and lists of names, too many names of soldiers who hadn't made it home. His handwriting grew smaller and more cramped as the entries progressed through his deployment. As if trying to contain the weight of what he had witnessed, the journal fell open to a page dated 3 years ago, the day of the blast that changed everything. His description was clinical. Detached. IED detonated 0847 hours. 20 meters southwest of patrol position. Martinez and Jackson caught in secondary blast radius. Retrieved both soldiers under fire. Sustained minor shrapnel to left leg. Treated in field. Mission continued. Minor shrapnel. Cole stared at those words, remembering the chaos of that morning. The deafening explosion, the taste of dust and cordite, the weight of Martinez's unconscious body as Cole dragged him to safety. Then the return trip for Jackson. Ignoring the burning sensation in his own leg as enemy fire peppered the ground around them, the field medic had pulled 3 small fragments from his leg and applied a hasty bandage. In the heat of the moment, with 2 soldiers fighting for their lives, Cole's injury had seemed insignificant. He had refused evacuation, insisting he could continue with the mission. Looking back, he wondered if that decision had cost him more. Then he realized his phone buzzed with a text from his younger brother Danny. "Mom's birthday is next week. You coming to Denver?" Cole stared at the message for several minutes before typing back, "We'll try. Work is busy." It was only partially true. Work was always busy, but Cole had been avoiding family gatherings for months. Danny was 31, a successful architect with a wife and 2 young children, the kind of settled life that Cole had once imagined for himself. But somewhere between his 3rd deployment and the long nights of physical therapy after his discharge, that vision had faded. Danny represented everything Cole felt he had lost: normalcy, ease, the ability to plan for a future without wondering if his body would cooperate. His brother's concerned questions and careful attention to Cole's limping had become too much to bear. It was easier to stay away than to admit he wasn't the invincible older brother Danny remembered. The next morning brought another training session, this one focused on close-quarters combat. Cole demonstrated proper stance and movement, pushing through the familiar burning sensation in his left leg. The recruits watched intently as he showed them how to maintain balance while transitioning between positions. "The key is keeping your center of gravity low," Cole explained, dropping into a defensive crouch. "Never let your opponent know where you're vulnerable." The irony of his words wasn't lost on him. Here he stood, teaching others to protect their weak spots while hiding his own. The pain had been getting worse lately, especially during the colder mornings. Sometimes he felt something shift in his leg, like a piece of gravel working its way through muscle. But acknowledging it felt like surrender. After the session, Sarah cornered him in the equipment room. "Cole, I'm not asking as your colleague anymore. I'm asking as your friend. Something's wrong with your leg, and it's getting worse." Cole methodically cleaned and stored the training weapons, avoiding her gaze. "I appreciate your concern, but stop." Sarah's voice carried a firmness that made him look up. "I've watched you teach tactical medicine to dozens of recruits. You tell them that ignoring injuries in the field gets people killed. How is this different?" For a moment, Cole's carefully maintained composure cracked. Sarah saw a flash of something raw in his eyes: pain, fear, maybe even relief at being seen. But just as quickly, the mask slipped back into place. "Because this isn't the field," he said quietly, "and I'm not responsible for anyone else's life anymore." "What about your own life?" Sarah asked. "Doesn't that matter?" Cole shouldered his gear bag and headed for the door. "I'll see you tomorrow, Sarah." That evening, Cole pulled out a small wooden box from the bottom drawer of his bedroom dresser. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, lay his Purple Heart. The metal felt heavier than its actual weight, carrying the burden of survival when others hadn't been as fortunate. He had never displayed it, never mentioned it to his civilian colleagues. It felt too much like taking credit for something that should have been shared with Martinez and Jackson, who had taken the worst of that blast. Martinez had lost his left arm, but recovered enough to return to his family in Texas. Jackson had suffered a traumatic brain injury that ended his military career, but hadn't stopped him from becoming an advocate for veterans' rights. Both men had faced their injuries head-on, accepting help, adapting. Moving forward, Cole rewrapped the metal and closed the box. Tomorrow he would teach another group of recruits about tactical awareness and battlefield medicine. He would ignore the increasing pain in his leg and the growing concern in Sarah's eyes. He would continue the careful balancing act that had become his life, staying strong enough to help others while refusing to acknowledge his own need for help. Outside his apartment window, the Colorado mountains stood silhouetted against the evening sky, solid and unchanging. Cole had chosen to settle here after his discharge partly because the landscape reminded him of Afghanistan, rugged, demanding, unforgiving of weakness. It was the kind of place where a man could test himself against something bigger than his own limitations. But as he settled into bed that night, Cole couldn't shake Sarah's question. Didn't his own life matter? The pain in his leg pulsed with his heartbeat, a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing. He told himself it was manageable, just as he had for the past 3 years. Tomorrow would be another day of staying strong, staying useful, staying in control. He didn't know that tomorrow would be the day everything changed. The obstacle course Cole had designed stretched across 2 acres of the training facility, a meticulous recreation of the Afghan terrain that still haunted his dreams. Concrete barriers simulated compound walls, sand-filled trenches mimicked roadside ditches, and scattered debris created the chaotic environment where split-second decisions meant survival. This course isn't about speed, Cole announced to the morning's group of police officers seeking advanced tactical training. It's about maintaining situational awareness under pressure. Move with purpose, not panic. Sarah watched from the medical station she had set up at the course's midpoint, noting how Cole's instructions carried the weight of hard-earned experience. She had studied the course layout and recognized it as more than just training. It was Cole's way of processing memories he refused to discuss. The morning air carried a crisp bite that made Cole's left leg ache more than usual. He had taken 3 ibuprofen before leaving his apartment, double his normal dose, but the persistent burning sensation had grown to a sharp, stabbing pain that shot up his thigh with each step. Watch your 6 o'clock position as you navigate the debris field, Cole called out, demonstrating the proper low crouch that would minimize exposure to enemy fire. As he shifted his weight to move between obstacles, something in his left leg gave way, not the muscle or bone, but something deeper, something that felt like it was cutting through tissue. The pain was immediate and breathtaking, but Cole had learned to compartmentalize physical discomfort years ago. He finished the demonstration and moved to the next station, where trainees practiced communication under simulated fire. Remember, clear and concise reports, he told the group, his voice steady despite the cold sweat gathering on his forehead. Panic in your voice spreads through the unit faster than enemy fire. 20 minutes later, as Cole demonstrated proper cover positions behind a concrete barrier, the stabbing sensation in his leg suddenly intensified. The world tilted sideways, and for a moment, he was back in Afghanistan, feeling the ground shake beneath him as the eye detonated. But this wasn't a flashback. This was his body finally refusing to carry the burden he had imposed on it. Cole's vision grayed at the edges as he tried to maintain his balance. The obstacle course began to spin around him, and he felt his knees give way. The last thing he remembered was Sarah's voice calling his name and the taste of dust as he hit the ground. When consciousness returned, Cole found himself staring up at the Colorado sky from a stretcher. Sarah's face appeared in his field of vision, her professional mask unable to completely hide her concern. "Don't try to sit up," she said firmly, her hands already checking his pulse and pupils. "You've been unconscious for about 3 minutes. Can you tell me where you are?" "The training facility," Cole managed, his voice hoarser than expected. "What happened?" "You collapsed during the demonstration," Sarah explained while signaling to the paramedics who had arrived with the ambulance. "Your blood pressure dropped significantly, and you were unresponsive. We're taking you to Denver General." Cole tried to protest, but the effort of speaking sent fresh waves of pain through his left leg. Something was definitely wrong. The sensation was different now, sharper and more localized, as if whatever had been moving through his tissue had finally found its intended destination. The ambulance ride became a blur of sirens and medical jargon as paramedics monitored his vital signs. An established and 4-line. Sarah rode alongside them, having insisted on accompanying Cole to the hospital. Her presence was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder that his carefully maintained independence was crumbling at Denver General's emergency department. Cole found himself in a curtained bay surrounded by the familiar chaos of a trauma center. The antiseptic smell and constant beeping of monitors brought back memories of his own treatment years earlier, though that experience had been brief and seemingly routine. Dr. Elena Rodriguez entered the bay with the confident stride of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes carried the intensity of a surgeon who had seen too much suffering to waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Merrick, I'm Dr. Rodriguez. Can you describe what happened before you lost consciousness?" Cole recounted the morning's events while Dr. Rodriguez conducted a preliminary examination. When she pressed along his left thigh, he involuntarily tensed as pain shot through the muscle. "How long have you been experiencing pain in this leg?" she asked. "It's just residual discomfort from an old injury," Cole replied automatically. "Nothing significant." Dr. Rodriguez's expression suggested she had heard similar denials from countless patients. "According to your intake form, you served in Afghanistan. Were you injured in combat?" Cole's jaw tightened. "Minor shrapnel wound 3 years ago. Already treated and cleared for duty. We're gonna need x-rays and a CT scan," Dr. Rodriguez sighed, making notes on her tablet. "Something caused you to collapse, and given your history, we need to rule out complications from your previous injury." As they wheeled Cole toward radiology, Sarah walked alongside the gurney. "Your emergency contact form lists a Daniel Merrick in Denver. Is that family?" Cole closed his eyes, knowing that this was the moment his careful isolation would begin to unravel. "My younger brother. But don't call him yet. This might be nothing." "Cole, you collapsed and lost consciousness. That's not nothing." 30 minutes later, Cole lay on the CT scanner table while machines mapped the interior of his body with mechanical precision. The technician's expression remained professionally neutral, but Cole caught him taking a second look at the images appearing on his screen. Back in the emergency bay, Dr. Rodriguez returned with a radiologist whose grim expression suggested the news wasn't routine. They huddled around a computer screen, their voices too low for Cole to hear their discussion. Finally, Dr. Rodriguez approached his bed with the careful demeanor of someone delivering difficult news. "Mr. Merrick, we found something on your scans that requires immediate attention. There's a metallic fragment in your left leg, approximately 3 centimeters long, positioned very close to your femoral artery." Cole felt the world tilt again, though this time he remained conscious. "That's impossible." The field medics removed all the shrapnel. "Unfortunately, it's not uncommon for small fragments to be missed during trauma surgery, especially in combat conditions," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "The concerning factor is that this fragment appears to have migrated from its original position. It's now pressing against your femoral artery, which explains your symptoms and the collapse." The implications hit Cole like a physical blow. For 3 years, he had been walking around with a piece of metal, slowly working its way toward one of his body's major blood vessels. Every training session, every demonstration, every moment he had pushed through the pain had been a gamble with his life. "What does that mean for treatment?" Cole asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "We need to consult with our vascular surgery team immediately," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "This type of extraction requires extreme precision. If the fragment shifts during removal, it could cause massive internal bleeding. We'll also need to contact military ordnance experts to identify the exact type of shrapnel we're dealing with." As the medical team mobilized around him, Cole stared at the ceiling. tiles and tried to process what he had just learned. The obstacle course that had triggered his collapse wasn't just a training tool. It was the arena where his body had finally rebelled against years of denial and stubborn self-reliance. His phone buzzed with a text. Message from Sarah. Already. Called Danny. He's on his way. Cole closed his eyes and felt the last of his carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble. The battle he had been fighting for 3 years. The one against accepting help, admitting weakness, acknowledging that survival sometimes required surrender, was about to intensify in ways he couldn't have imagined. Danny Merrick burst through the emergency department doors with the desperate energy of someone who had driven 90 miles per hour from Denver, his architect's mind already constructing worst-case scenarios from the limited information Sarah had provided over the phone. At 31, he possessed the same strong jawline and dark eyes as his older brother. But where Cole carried the weathered intensity of a combat veteran, Danny retained the optimistic bearing of someone whose biggest battles had been fought over building permits and design revisions. "Where is he?" Danny asked the receptionist, his voice tight with controlled panic. Sarah appeared at his side, having waited in the lobby after calling him. "He's stable, Danny. They're running more tests, but he's conscious and alert." As Sarah led him through the maze of hospital corridors, Danny peppered her with questions. What exactly happened? Sarah said he collapsed, but Cole's never been sick a day in his life. Even as a kid, he'd walk around with broken bones before admitting something was wrong. "It's part of the problem," Sarah replied carefully. "The doctors found something on his scans. A piece of shrapnel from Afghanistan that's been moving through his leg for years." Danny stopped walking. "Shrapnel?" He told us he only had minor injuries from his last deployment. A few cuts, maybe. Some bruises. Cole doesn't share much about what really happened over there, Sarah said gently. But from what the doctors are saying, this fragment should have been found and removed years ago. They found Cole in a private room, connected to monitors and in foredrip, staring out the window at the Denver skyline. The afternoon sun highlighted the new lines around his eyes, making him look older than his 34 years. When he turned to see Danny approaching, his expression mixed relief with resignation. "Don't look at me like that," Cole said before. Danny could speak. "I'm fine." "Fine?" Danny's voice cracked with emotion. "Sarah tells me you've been walking around for 3 years with a piece of metal threatening to kill you, and you call that fine?" Cole shifted uncomfortably in the hospital bed. "The situation is under control. The doctors know what they're dealing with now." "Under control?" Danny pulled a chair closer to the bed, his hand shaking slightly. "Cole, what if this had happened while you were alone? What if you'd been driving? What if—" "But it didn't," Cole interrupted. "It happened at the training facility with medical personnel present." Sarah handled the situation perfectly. Danny stared at his brother, recognizing the same stubborn deflection that had characterized Cole's behavior since returning from Afghanistan. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell any of us that you were in pain?" Before Cole could answer, a new voice interrupted their conversation. "Because admitting pain feels like admitting failure to soldiers like us." Both brothers turned to see a man in his 50s standing in the doorway, wearing jeans and a Colorado Rockies t-shirt. His graying hair was cut in a military style, and his bearing carried the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to command. Cole's expression shifted to surprise, then something approaching embarrassment. "Sergeant Major Williams," Cole said, attempting to sit up straighter despite the monitors attached to his chest. "Just Tom now," Williams replied, entering the room with the easy authority that had made him one of Cole's most respected leaders. "Sarah tracked me down through the veterans network. Figured you might need some familiar faces around." Danny looked between the two men, sensing the weight of shared history. "You served together?" Tom was Cole's squad leader during his second and third deployments, Williams explained. settling into another chair. "I also happened to be there the day your brother earned his reputation as someone too stubborn to know when he's hurt." Cole's jaw tightened. "Tom, you don't need to. Actually, I think I do," Williams interrupted gently. "Danny, your brother saved 2 men's lives the day he got injured. Martinez and Jackson were both caught in the secondary blast from an IED. Cole went back for them twice, under enemy fire, with his own leg torn up from shrapnel." The room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of Cole's heart monitor. Danny stared at his brother with a mixture of pride and pain, finally understanding the weight Cole had been carrying. The field medic pulled out what shrapnel he could. "See," Williams continued, "the combat medicine is about keeping people alive long enough to get real treatment. Sometimes things get missed." "The doctors say the fragment has been moving for years," Sarah added, having entered the room during Williams' explanation. "Every time Cole pushed through the pain, every training session, every time he refused to acknowledge something was wrong, he was risking his life." Cole looked down at his hands, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "I couldn't be the guy who survived when Martinez and Jackson didn't, and then complained about a little leg pain." Williams leaned forward, his voice taking on the firm but caring tone. He had used to counsel countless soldiers. "Son, Martinez lost his arm and learned to drive a combine harvester one-handed. Jackson's brain injury forced him to relearn how to read. But he's testified before Congress 3 times about veterans' health care. They didn't survive so you could destroy yourself out of guilt." "It's not that simple," Cole protested. "Isn't it?" Danny asked quietly. "Cole, I've watched you pull away from our family for 3 years. I thought it was just adjustment issues, maybe some depression. I never imagined you were literally dying in silence because you were afraid of looking weak." A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Rodriguez entered with a tablet and the serious expression of someone bearing complex news. "Mr. Merrick, we've completed your imaging studies and consulted with our vascular surgery team. The fragment is positioned in a very delicate location, and we've identified it as military-grade shrapnel specifically, a piece of artillery casing." She pulled up the scans on her tablet, showing them the clear outline of the metallic fragment nestled against Cole's femoral artery. "The good news is that it hasn't caused any immediate vascular damage. The concerning news is that it's unstable in its current position. Any significant movement could cause catastrophic bleeding. What are our options?" Williams asked, his military training automatically shifting into tactical assessment mode. "Surgery is the only viable option," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "However, this isn't a routine extraction. We'll need to coordinate with military ordnance experts to understand the fragment's composition and potential complications. The surgery itself will require both vascular and trauma specialists working simultaneously." Cole absorbed this information with the same stoic expression he had worn while receiving mission briefings in Afghanistan. "What are the risks?" "Paralysis, massive blood loss, potential amputation if we can't control bleeding," Dr. Rodriguez listed matter-of-factly. "But, Mr. Merrick, the alternative is living with a time bomb in your leg. The fragment will continue to move, and eventually it will cause the very complications we're trying to prevent." Danny reached over and gripped his brother's hand, a gesture they hadn't shared since childhood. "You don't have to face this alone anymore, Cole." For the first time in 3 years, Cole didn't pull away from his brother's touch. The weight of isolation he had carried since Afghanistan began to feel less like strength and more like the burden it had always been. The military ordnance specialist arrived at Denver General that evening with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades disarming explosive devices. Master Sergeant, retired, Elena Vasquez carried a specialized kit that looked more suited to a bomb disposal unit than a hospital, her weathered hand steady as she reviewed the medical scans on Dr. Rodriguez's computer. "This is definitely military ordnance. Vasquez confirmed, pointing to specific characteristics on the X-ray. And based on the density and metallic composition, I'd say it's from an improvised explosive device, specifically a pressure plate IED using artillery shell casings as the primary charge. Cole watched from his hospital bed as the two women analyzed the fragment that had been slowly killing him for 3 years. The clinical discussion felt surreal, as if they were examining someone else's body rather than the piece of metal that had shaped his daily existence. The concerning factor, Dr. Rodriguez added, is that we've discovered this fragment has migrated significantly from where it would have originally lodged. Mr. Merrick's medical records from his discharge show shrapnel removal from the lower leg, but this piece is now in his upper thigh. Danny, who had been quietly absorbing the technical details, finally spoke up. How is that possible? How does a piece of metal just move through someone's body? Muscle contractions, physical activity, even normal walking can cause small fragments to shift over time, Vasquez explained. In combat medicine, the priority is removing visible fragments and stopping immediate bleeding. Smaller pieces that aren't causing immediate problems sometimes get missed, especially in chaotic conditions. William shifted in his chair, his expression growing darker. I remember that day. The blast was bigger than usual. They had used multiple shells packed with additional explosives. The medics were overwhelmed. Martinez was losing blood fast. Jackson was unconscious with head trauma, and Cole kept insisting his injuries were minor. Because they were, Cole protested weakly. Compared to what Martinez and Jackson were dealing with, no, Williams interrupted firmly. They were minor. You were in shock, son. We all were. But you convinced everyone you were fine because that's what you needed to believe to keep functioning. Sarah had been quietly reviewing Cole's medical file from his discharge processing. Cole, according to this report, you were recommended for follow-up imaging within 6 months of your discharge. Did you ever complete that? Cole's silence provided the answer. The follow-up appointment had seemed unnecessary when he was busy transitioning to civilian life, finding work and establishing his new routine. The persistent pain had felt manageable compared to the larger challenge of rebuilding his identity. Outside the military, the original treating physician noted possible retained fragments in his discharge summary. Sarah continued reading. This wasn't missed, it was documented, and you were specifically told to get additional scans. Danny stared at his brother with a mixture of anger and disbelief. You knew there might be more shrapnel, and you just ignored it? It wasn't that simple, Cole said, his voice barely above a whisper. The follow-up was in Texas. I had already moved to Colorado, started the new job. The pain wasn't that bad most days, and I thought if something was seriously wrong, it would have gotten worse faster. It did get worse, Sarah pointed out. You've been compensating for increasing pain for months. I've watched you modify your training demonstrations, avoid certain movements, take more breaks. Your body was trying to tell you something was wrong. Doctor Rodriguez closed her tablet and turned to address the room. While we're discussing Mr. Merrick's medical history, I need to prepare you all for the complexity of the upcoming surgery. This isn't just about removing a piece of metal. The fragment is positioned against his femoral artery in a way that suggests it may have created scar tissue attachments. We could be looking at vascular reconstruction, nerve repair, or both. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Cole had spent 3 years avoiding this moment, the reckoning with the true cost of his Afghanistan injuries. Now, surrounded by people who cared about him, he couldn't run from the medical reality any longer. What's the timeline? Williams asked, shifting into problem-solving mode. We need to schedule the surgery within the next 48 hours, Dr. Rodriguez replied. The fragment's position is unstable. The collapse today suggests it shifted during physical activity, and we can't risk another movement that could cause arterial damage. Vasquez packed her equipment, having completed her assessment. I'll be available during the surgery to advise on fragment composition and any complications that might arise during extraction. In 30 years of bomb disposal, I've learned that military ordnance can be unpredictable even when it's not actively armed. After the specialist left, the room fell into contemplative silence. Danny had pulled his chair closer to Cole's bed, while Williams sat near the window, and Sarah busied herself checking Cole's vital signs with the automatic efficiency of medical training. "I need to call Martinez and Jackson," Cole said suddenly. "If this surgery goes wrong, they should know." "You're going to be fine," Danny said quickly, but Williams held up a hand. "No, he's right to think about that," Williams said. "But Cole, you're not calling them to say goodbye. You're calling them because it's time to stop carrying this burden alone. Martinez has been asking about you for 2 years through the Veterans Network. Jackson's been trying to track you down to invite you to his wedding." Cole looked genuinely surprised. "Jackson's getting married?" To his speech therapist from the V, Williams smiled. Turns out surviving a traumatic brain injury gave him perspective on what really matters. "He's been wanting to thank you properly for pulling him out of that blast zone." "They don't need to thank me," Cole said automatically. "Maybe not," Sarah interjected. "But maybe you need to let them. Maybe part of healing isn't just fixing your leg. It's accepting that your actions had meaning, that your survival serves a purpose beyond just staying strong for everyone else." Danny squeezed his brother's hand. "Cole, I've spent 3 years watching you disappear piece by piece. I thought I had lost you to whatever happened over there. I never imagined you were literally disappearing because you wouldn't let anyone help you stay alive." Cole closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of isolation beginning to shift. The fragment analysis report that Vasquez had left behind sat on his bedside table, a classified military document detailing the specific explosive device that had changed his life. It represented more than medical evidence. It was proof of the systematic failures that had left him wounded and overlooked. "The doctors want to do pre-surgical planning tomorrow," Dr. Rodriguez had explained before leaving. "That means more scans, blood work, and consultations with the entire surgical team. It's going to be a long day, but we want to be absolutely certain about our approach before we begin." Williams stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Cole, I'm going to stay in Denver until after your surgery. Danny's offered to let me crash at his place. You're not going through this with just hospital staff for support." "You don't have to do that," Cole protested, but Williams was already shaking his head. "Son, you saved 2 of my soldiers and never asked for anything in return. The least I can do is make sure you don't face this alone." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Besides, Martinez and Jackson are driving up from Texas tomorrow. They want to be here too." After Williams left, Danny settled into the reclining chair that would serve as his bed for the night. "I'm not leaving either. Mom and Dad wanted to drive down from Wyoming, but I told them to wait until after the surgery. No point in having everyone panic at once." Sarah gathered her things but lingered at the bedside. "Cole, I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to understand something. You've spent 3 years teaching tactical medicine to police officers and security personnel. You've probably saved more lives as a civilian instructor than you did as a soldier. Your survival matters beyond just the people in this room." As the evening settled into the quiet rhythms of hospital routine, Cole stared at the ceiling and tried to process the fundamental shift in his understanding of strength and weakness. For 3 years, he had defined courage as enduring pain without complaint. Now, facing surgery that could leave him paralyzed or dead, he was learning that sometimes courage meant accepting help from people who cared about him. The fragment analysis report remained on his nightstand, a reminder that bureaucratic failures and chaos had contributed to his current crisis. But more importantly, it represented the beginning of accountability, not just from the military medical system that had failed him, but from Cole himself for the 3 years he had spent avoiding the truth. Danny's quiet breathing from the nearby chair provided a comforting presence Cole hadn't realized he'd been missing. For the first time since his discharge, he wasn't facing a crisis alone. The realization was both terrifying and profoundly relieving. Terrifying because it meant acknowledging his need for support. Relieving because the weight of isolation had been slowly crushing him for years. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more consultations, and the growing certainty that his life was about to change dramatically. But tonight, surrounded by people who refused to let him suffer in silence, Cole allowed himself to hope that survival might mean more than just enduring pain. It might mean learning to live again. The pre-surgical preparation began at dawn with a parade of medical specialists, each requiring their own assessments and consultations. Cole had been moved to a larger room to accommodate the constant stream of visitors and the growing pile of medical equipment needed for monitoring his condition. The morning light streaming through the windows felt different, somehow sharper, more precious, as if his body's rebellion had heightened his awareness of simple things like sunshine and the sound of Danny's quiet conversation with the nursing staff. Dr. Rodriguez arrived with a psychiatrist, Dr. Amanda Foster, whose presence immediately put Cole on guard. He had dealt with military psychologists during his discharge processing and found their probing questions invasive and ultimately pointless. Mr. Merrick, Dr. Foster needs to complete a pre-surgical psychological evaluation, Dr. Rodriguez explained. It's standard procedure for high-risk surgeries, especially when the patient has a history of combat trauma. I don't have PTSD, Cole said automatically, the same response he had given to every mental health screening since leaving the military. Dr. Foster, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair, settled into a chair with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to resistance. I'm not here to diagnose PTSD, Mr. Merrick. I'm here to help the surgical team understand your psychological state before a procedure that could significantly change your life. My psychological state is fine, Cole replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The events of the past 24 hours had shaken his carefully maintained sense of control. Dr. Foster consulted her tablet. You've been experiencing chronic pain for 3 years, avoided medical follow-up despite documented recommendations, and isolated yourself from family and friends. From a psychological perspective, that suggests significant internal distress. Danny, who had been quietly listening from his chair, finally spoke up. Cole, just answer her questions honestly. Nobody's trying to trap you or declare you unfit. We just want to make sure you have the best possible chance of recovery. For the next hour, Dr. Foster guided Cole through a series of questions about his emotional state, his support network, and his coping mechanisms. The conversation felt like an archaeological dig, unearthing layers of grief and guilt that Cole had buried under years of stoic determination. Tell me about the day you were injured, Dr. Foster said gently. Cole's jaw tightened, but he found himself describing the eye blast in more detail than he had ever shared with anyone. The metallic taste of fear when the explosion knocked him down. The desperate urgency of reaching Martinez and Jackson before enemy fire could pin them down. The strange detachment he had felt while dragging their unconscious bodies to safety, as if he were watching someone else's heroic actions. You mentioned feeling detached, Doctor. Foster noted. That's a common response to trauma, the mind's way of protecting itself during overwhelming events. But Mr. Merrick, you've been maintaining that detachment for 3 years. When did you last feel fully present in your own life? The question caught Cole off guard. He struggled to remember the last time he had felt genuinely engaged with his surroundings, rather than simply going through the motions of daily existence. I don't understand the question, he said finally. When did you last feel joy, excitement, even appropriate anger or sadness? Doctor, Foster clarified. Emotional numbness is often a coping mechanism, but it can become a prison if maintained too long. Before Cole could answer, a commotion in the hallway announced the arrival of new visitors. Martinez and Jackson appeared in the doorway, and Cole felt his carefully maintained composure crack completely. Martinez looked exactly as Cole remembered him, though he now wore a prosthetic left arm that he carried with unconscious confidence. Jackson was thinner than before, his speech slightly slower and more deliberate, lasting effects of his traumatic brain injury, but his smile carried the same warmth that had made him popular with their entire unit. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Martinez said with a grin, entering the room with the easy familiarity of shared combat experience. "Sergeant Major Williams told us you were trying to die quietly without telling anybody. That's pretty selfish, even for you, Merrick." Jackson followed behind, moving with the careful precision of someone who had relearned basic motor skills through months of therapy. "Cole, you look terrible. Even worse than that time you ate the expired MRE in Kandahar." The sight of his former brothers-in-arms overwhelmed Cole in ways he hadn't anticipated. These were the men he had pulled from the blast zone, the ones whose survival had justified his own in his mind. Seeing them healthy, functioning, and apparently thriving despite their injuries, forced him to confront the narrative he had constructed about weakness and recovery. "How did you find me?" Cole asked, his voice unsteady. "Williams put out word through the Veterans Network," Martinez explained, settling into a chair and automatically adjusting his prosthetic arm. "Took about 6 hours to track you down. You've gotten pretty good at hiding, brother." Dr. Foster watched the reunion with professional interest, noting how Cole's entire demeanor changed in the presence of his former comrades. The emotional walls he had maintained throughout their session began to lower, revealing glimpses of the man he had been before survival became his primary identity. "Gentlemen, I'm Dr. Foster," she introduced herself. "I was just discussing with Mr. Merrick how he's been coping since his discharge. Perhaps you could provide some perspective on his emotional state during your service together." Jackson looked at Cole with the direct honesty that had characterized their friendship. Cole was the guy who held everything together. When Martinez and I got hurt, he made sure we survived. But even before that, he was always the one taking care of everyone else. Never complained, never asked for help, never admitted when something was bothering him. "Sounds familiar," Danny muttered from his corner. Martinez nodded in agreement. The day we got hit, Cole had been dealing with some personal stuff, family problems, I think. But he never let it affect his performance. Even with his own leg torn up, he kept focused on getting us to safety. "What kind of family problems?" Dr. Foster asked gently. Cole shot a warning look at Martinez, but his friend continued anyway. His dad had been in the hospital, heart attack or something. Cole had been trying to get leave to go home, but the deployment was extended. He was dealing with guilt about not being there for his family, and then the blast happened. The room fell silent as this piece of Cole's history settled into place. Danny stared at his brother with new understanding. Their father's heart attack had occurred during Cole's final deployment, and Cole had never mentioned feeling conflicted about his absence. "You never told me you wanted to come home," Danny said quietly. "Because I couldn't," Cole replied. "My unit needed me there. People were depending on me to do my job." Dr. Foster made a note on her tablet. "Mr. Merrick, it sounds like you've been carrying responsibility for everyone else's well-being while neglecting your own for much longer than 3 years. This pattern of self-sacrifice may have contributed to your reluctance to seek medical treatment." Martinez leaned forward, his expression serious. "Cole, after I lost my arm, I spent months refusing physical therapy because I thought accepting help meant accepting defeat. It took Jackson here, a guy relearning how to read, to convince me that recovery isn't surrender. The brain injury was the best thing that ever happened to me," Jackson added with characteristic bluntness. It forced me to slow down, accept help, and figure out what really mattered. Turns out, what mattered wasn't being the toughest guy in the room. It was letting people who cared about me help me heal. Cole looked around the room at the faces of people who refused to let him face this crisis alone. For the first time in 3 years, the weight of survival felt less like a burden and more like an opportunity. The psychiatric evaluation continued with Dr. Foster guiding Cole through exercises designed to assess his cognitive state and emotional readiness for major surgery. Martinez and Jackson had settled in for what appeared to be an extended visit, their presence providing both comfort and accountability that Cole couldn't easily dismiss. "Mr. Merrick, I'd like you to look at this," Dr. Foster said, placing a heavily annotated military tactical manual on his bedside table. Sarah had retrieved it from Cole's apartment along with a change of clothes, thinking he might want familiar items during his hospital stay. Cole stared at the manual, recognizing his own handwriting in the margins, detailed notes on troop movements, tactical assessments, and leadership strategies that had guided him through 3 deployments. Every page contained evidence of his compulsive need for control and precision, his identity fundamentally tied to military competence. "What do you see when you look at this?" Dr. Foster asked. "A training manual," Cole replied, but his voice carried uncertainty. "Look closer at your annotations," she encouraged. "What story do they tell about who you were as a soldier?" Cole flipped through the pages, seeing his handwriting evolve from the confident marks of a young soldier to the increasingly dense, almost desperate notations of someone trying to anticipate every possible scenario. By the final deployment, his notes had become obsessive, detailed contingency plans for situations that might never occur. "I was thorough," Cole said finally. "You were trying to control the uncontrollable," Dr. Foster observed gently. "Mr. Merrick, this manual shows someone who believed that perfect preparation could prevent loss. But combat isn't predictable, and neither is life. The fragment in your leg is proof that sometimes bad things happen despite our best efforts." Jackson leaned forward, recognizing something in Cole's expression. "Doc, could I share something? After my brain injury, I had to relearn how to read. The first book I managed to finish was a kid's picture book about a robot who tried to plan for everything. The robot made lists and backup plans for his backup plans. But he never actually lived because he was too busy preparing for life." "That's a children's book," Cole said dismissively. "Yeah, and it took me 3 months to read it because my brain had to rebuild those pathways." Jackson replied matter-of-factly, "But the point stands. You've been so busy trying to be invincible that you forgot how to be human." Danny had been quietly observing the exchange, but now he pulled out his phone and showed Cole a series of text messages. "These are from the past 2 years, Cole. Can't make Christmas work commitment. Sorry. Can't attend Dad's retirement party training schedule. Won't make it to Emma's birthday prior obligations." Cole looked at the messages, recognizing his own words, but seeing them now as a pattern of avoidance rather than professional dedication. "I was building the business. The training facility was your excuse," Danny interrupted. "Cole, Emma is my 6-year-old daughter. She's been asking why Uncle Cole doesn't come to family events anymore. I've been telling her you're busy with important work, but the truth is, I think you've been afraid we'd notice you were struggling." The weight of Danny's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Cole had convinced himself that his absence from family gatherings was protecting his loved ones from his problems, but he was beginning to understand that his isolation had caused its own kind of pain. Dr. Foster made notes on her tablet. "Mr. Merrick, avoidance is a common response to trauma, but it often creates secondary problems that can be worse than the original injury. You've spent 3 years avoiding medical treatment, family connections, and emotional engagement. Tomorrow's surgery isn't just about removing shrapnel. It's about removing the barriers you've built between yourself and the people who care about you. Sarah entered the room carrying coffee for everyone, having spent the morning coordinating with Cole's employer and handling the practical details of his extended absence. How's the evaluation going? We're exploring Cole's relationship with control and vulnerability, Dr. Foster explained. His tactical manual here tells an interesting story about someone who believes that perfect preparation can prevent all negative outcomes. Sarah examined the manual, noting the increasingly dense annotations throughout Cole's deployments. Cole, you've taught tactical medicine to hundreds of students over the past 3 years. What's the first thing you tell them about treating injuries in the field? Triage, Cole answered automatically. Assess, prioritize, treat the most life-threatening conditions first. And what do you tell them about soldiers who refuse medical treatment? Cole's expression darkened as he recognized the trap. That pride and denial get people killed. So why doesn't that apply to you? Sarah asked directly. The question hung in the air, while Cole struggled to formulate an answer that didn't sound hypocritical. The truth was that he had been applying different standards to himself, standards that prioritized appearing strong over staying alive. Martinez shifted in his chair, adjusting his prosthetic arm with the unconscious ease of someone who had accepted his limitations and adapted accordingly. Cole, you want to know what changed my perspective? It was watching Jackson relearn how to tie his shoes. This tough as nails infantry soldier, sitting in a rehabilitation center, celebrating because he managed to make a bow without falling over. It was the bravest thing I'd ever seen. Braver than combat? Dr. Foster asked. Absolutely, Martinez replied without hesitation. In combat, you react on instinct and training. In rehabilitation, you have to choose vulnerability every single day. You have to admit you need help, accept that you're not who you used to be, and trust other people to help you become who you're going to be. Jackson nodded in agreement. The brain injury forced me to surrender control in ways that terrified me. But Cole, that surrender taught me something I never learned as a soldier, that accepting help isn't weakness, it's strategy. Cole looked around the room at the faces of people who had refused to let him suffer alone. The tactical manual lay open to a page where he had written "Self-reliance is survival" in bold letters. Now, surrounded by evidence of love and support, that philosophy felt less like wisdom and more like the rationalization of a frightened man. The surgery tomorrow is high risk, Dr. Rodriguez had explained during her morning visit. But Mr. Merrick, the greater risk is continuing to live with the fragment in place. We've assembled our best team, and we have every reason to expect a successful outcome. As the afternoon wore on, Cole found himself engaging more naturally with his visitors. The conversation flowed between memories of their service together, updates on their civilian lives, and gentle challenges to Cole's insistence on handling everything alone. For the first time in 3 years, he felt connected to something larger than his own carefully managed existence. The tactical manual remained open on his bedside table, its pages filled with evidence of his former identity as someone who believed control was possible. Tomorrow, he would undergo surgery that would require him to surrender that control completely, trusting other people to save his life while he lay unconscious and vulnerable. The final pre-surgical scans were scheduled for early evening, a comprehensive imaging series designed to provide the surgical team with precise mapping of the shrapnel's position and surrounding tissue damage. Cole had been fasting since noon, in preparation for the morning surgery, and the combination of hunger and anxiety was making him increasingly restless. Dr. Rodriguez returned with the radiology team just as visiting hours were ending, but she made an exception for Cole's growing support network. This should be routine, she explained to the assembled group. We're doing a final CT angiogram to map blood vessel positioning around the fragment. The imaging suite felt like a scene from a science fiction movie, with its massive machines. and computer monitors displaying cross-sectional views of Cole's body in stark detail. Martinez and Jackson watched from the observation room while Danny and Sarah stayed in the patient area, providing moral support as Cole was positioned on the scanning table. "Just breathe normally," the technician instructed. "This will take about 20 minutes. But 10 minutes into the scan, Cole noticed the technician's expression change from routine concentration to concerned focus. She called for Dr. Rodriguez, who appeared at the console with the same serious demeanor she had worn when delivering the original diagnosis. After what felt like an eternity, the scanning stopped and Cole was moved back to his room. Dr. Rodriguez, followed with a radiologist whose grim expression suggested the news wouldn't be routine after all. "Mr. Merrick, we need to discuss our findings," Dr. Rodriguez began, pulling up the new images on her tablet. "The good news is that we have excellent visualization of the known fragment and the surrounding anatomy. The concerning news is that we found something else." She manipulated the images, zooming in on a different area of Cole's leg. "There's a second metallic fragment, significantly larger than the first, positioned near your lumbar spine. This piece appears to have migrated from the original blast site and is now resting against nerve bundles that control leg function." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Cole's heart monitor. Danny gripped the bed rail, his face pale with shock. Sarah moved closer to examine the scans, her medical training helping her understand the implications, even as her personal concern for Cole intensified. "How did the previous scans miss this?" Williams asked, his military training automatically shifting to problem-solving mode. "The first fragment was metallic enough to obscure this second piece on standard X-rays," the radiologist explained. "It wasn't until we used contrast imaging that we could see the full extent of the retained shrapnel." Martinez leaned forward in his chair. "Doc, what does this mean for the surgery?" Dr. Rodriguez closed her tablet and faced the group directly. "It means we're dealing with a much more complex situation than we originally anticipated. The first fragment threatens vascular damage, but this second piece could cause permanent paralysis if it shifts even slightly during surgical manipulation." Cole absorbed this information with the same stoic expression he had maintained throughout his military service, but internally, his carefully constructed world was collapsing. For 3 years, he had been living not just with one life-threatening condition, but with two. Every training session, every demonstration, every moment he had pushed through pain had been a gamble with his ability to walk. "What are our options?" Cole asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "We need to bring in a neurosurgical team to work simultaneously with our vascular specialists," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "This becomes a dual surgery with significantly higher risks, not just of bleeding or infection, but of permanent disability." Jackson, who had been quietly processing the news, finally spoke. "Cole, how long have you been experiencing back pain or leg weakness?" Cole thought back over the past year, remembering mornings when his left leg felt unsteady, afternoons when lower back pain made it difficult to concentrate, evenings when numbness in his foot made him stumble. He had attributed all of these symptoms to general wear and tear, the price of an active lifestyle and demanding work. "About a year," he admitted, "maybe longer. I thought I was just getting older, being on my feet all day." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "Cole, you've been experiencing neurological symptoms for a year and didn't think to mention them too." "Anyone?" "They weren't that bad," Cole protested. But even as he said it, he recognized the familiar pattern of minimization that had characterized his response to the leg pain. Dr. Rodriguez pulled up additional images showing the proximity of the spinal fragment to critical nerve pathways. "Mr. Merrick, this fragment is positioned in such a way that any significant movement could result in complete loss of motor function in your left leg. The fact that you've maintained mobility this long is actually remarkable." Williams stood and walked to the window, his expression dark with memories of battlefield medicine and the soldiers who hadn't been as fortunate as Cole. In 30 years of military service, I've seen a lot of misdiagnoses, but nothing like this. You've been walking around with what amounts to 2 unexploded bombs in your body. The metaphor hit Cole with unexpected force. He had spent 3 years thinking of himself as strong enough to handle the pain, disciplined enough to push through discomfort. But the reality was that he had been one wrong step, one hard landing, one unfortunate twist away from catastrophic injury or death. Danny had been quietly staring at the scans, trying to process the magnitude of what his brother had been hiding. Cole, the family camping trip last summer, you said you couldn't come because of work. But it was because you were afraid, wasn't it? You were afraid something like this might happen around Emma and the other kids. Cole couldn't meet his brother's eyes. The camping trip had indeed been avoided because of fear, not the fear of appearing weak, but the deeper fear that his body might betray him in front of his niece and nephew. He had imagined collapsing during a hike, being unable to help if someone else got injured, becoming a liability rather than the strong uncle he wanted to be. The surgical team is going to need several hours to plan this procedure, Dr. Rodriguez continued. We're looking at a minimum of 8 hours of surgery with multiple specialists. The risks include paralysis, loss of sensation, chronic pain, and the standard surgical risks of bleeding and infection. Master Sergeant Vasquez returned to the room as Dr. Rodriguez was explaining the surgical complexity. I've been consulting with additional ordnance experts about the larger fragment. Based on the imaging, we believe it's from the primary charge of the IED, a much more significant piece of military hardware than the smaller fragment. She displayed her own tablet showing technical specifications of the explosive device that had nearly killed Cole and his brothers 3 years ago. This type of ordnance creates fragments that can continue moving through tissue for years after the initial blast. Mr. Merrick, you've essentially been living with a slow-motion version of your original injury. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as Cole's support network processed this revelation. Sarah coordinated with the nursing staff about extended visiting hours. Williams contacted additional members of Cole's former unit who might want to know about the surgery. Benny called their parents in Wyoming, finally unable to shield them from the severity of their son's condition. Cole lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles and trying to reconcile 3 years of carefully managed pain with the reality that he had been slowly dying. The second fragment X-ray represented more than medical evidence. It was proof of the layers of damage and denial he had been living with, the depth of wounds that went far beyond physical injury. For the first time since his discharge from the military, Cole allowed himself to fully acknowledge how close he had come to losing everything, not just his life, but his ability to walk, to work, to maintain the independence that had become his primary identity. The realization was both terrifying and oddly liberating. Terrifying because it meant accepting how little control he actually had. Liberating because it meant he no longer had to pretend that control was possible. Tomorrow's surgery would require him to surrender completely to the skill of others, to trust that vulnerability might be the path to survival rather than its opposite. The boy who had believed that perfect preparation could prevent loss was about to learn whether surrender might be the most courageous act of all. The night before surgery stretched endlessly, marked by the quiet efficiency of hospital staff preparing for what would be one of the most complex procedures in Denver General's recent history. Cole's room had been moved to the surgical floor, where specialized monitoring equipment hummed quietly alongside his bed. The preoperative preparation felt like mission planning from his military days, methodical, comprehensive, and tinged with the knowledge that everything could change in an instant. Dr. Rodriguez had assembled a surgical team that read like a medical dream roster. Dr. James Shun, a neurosurgeon with expertise in spinal trauma. Dr. Maria Santos, a vascular specialist known for her precision and high-risk procedures, and Dr. Michael Foster, an orthopedic surgeon experienced in combat-related injuries. Master Sergeant Vasquez would remain on standby throughout the procedure, ready to advise on ordnance-related complications. Mr. Merrick, Dr. Rodriguez explained during the final briefing, "We've scheduled 8 hours for this surgery, but it could extend longer if we encounter unexpected complications. The dual-team approach means we'll work on both fragments simultaneously to minimize your time under anesthesia." Cole nodded, accepting the technical details with the same focus he had once applied to mission briefings. But this time, he wasn't the one making tactical decisions. He was the objective. Vulnerable and dependent on others for survival. Sarah had volunteered to stay through the night, ostensibly to help with medical coordination, but really because she couldn't bear the thought of Cole facing this alone. She sat in the chair beside his bed, reading through his tactical manual and making occasional observations about the evolution of his handwriting throughout his deployments. "Your annotations get smaller and more detailed as the tours progress," she noted. "By the third deployment, you were trying to account for variables that no one could reasonably predict." "Attention to detail keeps people alive," Cole replied, but his voice carried less conviction than usual. "So does knowing when to trust other people," Sarah countered gently. "Cole, tomorrow you're going to have to do something that goes against every instinct you've developed as a soldier. You're going to have to surrender control completely." The word surrender had always carried negative connotations for Cole: defeat, weakness, failure. But as he lay in the hospital bed, surrounded by people who had refused to let him face this crisis alone, the concept was beginning to take on different meanings. Perhaps surrender wasn't about giving up, but about trusting others to carry the fight when he couldn't. Danny had driven back to his house to shower and change clothes, but returned within 2 hours, unable to stay away. He brought with him a small digital camera and a sheepish expression. "I know this might seem weird," he said, "but I thought you might want to record a message, just in case." Cole stared at the camera, recognizing both the practicality and the emotional weight of his brother's suggestion. In the military, soldiers often recorded final messages before dangerous missions, not out of pessimism, but out of love for the people they might not see again. "What would I say?" Cole asked. "Whatever you want them to hear," Danny replied simply. For the next hour, Cole recorded a series of short messages. To his parents, he offered apologies for the years of distance and gratitude for their unwavering support. To Martinez and Jackson, he expressed pride in their recoveries and friendship that had sustained him through his darkest moments. To Sarah, he acknowledged feelings he had been afraid to examine, much less express. But the longest message was for Danny himself, a conversation between brothers that should have happened years earlier. "Danny, I need you to understand something," Cole said, looking directly into the camera. "After Afghanistan, I felt like a fraud. I survived when other good soldiers didn't, and I couldn't figure out how to justify that. So I decided I had to be perfect, never need help, never show weakness, never be a burden to anyone. But all I did was become a different kind of burden, the brother who disappeared, the friend who stopped showing up, the man who thought he could handle everything alone." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "If something goes wrong tomorrow, I don't want you to remember me as the guy who was too proud to ask for help. I want you to remember that in the end, I learned to trust the people who loved me. That's not surrender. That's courage." After finishing the recordings, Cole felt an unexpected sense of peace. The messages weren't morbid preparations for death, but honest acknowledgments of love and connection that he had been afraid to express while healthy. The video represented his acceptance of vulnerability and his willingness to let others see him as he truly was: scared, imperfect, and profoundly grateful for their presence in his life. Williams returned that evening with additional visitors. from Cole's former unit. Staff Sergeant Lisa Park had driven from Kansas, and Corporal Miguel Torres had flown in from California. The reunion filled Cole's room with the easy camaraderie of soldiers who had shared experiences that civilians could never fully understand. "You know," Park said, settling into a chair with the comfort of someone who had spent many nights in uncomfortable places, "we've all been worried about you for years. Williams kept saying you were doing fine in Colorado, but none of us believed him." "Why not?" Cole asked. "Because we know you," Torres replied matter-of-factly. "You're the guy who carried Jackson 2 miles with your own leg torn up. You're not the type to just disappear unless something was seriously wrong." The observation hit Cole with unexpected force. His former comrades had seen through his carefully maintained facade, not because they were particularly perceptive, but because they knew him well enough to recognize when his behavior didn't match his character. "I thought I was protecting you from my problems," Cole admitted. "That's the stupidest thing you've ever said," Park replied with characteristic bluntness. "And that's saying something, considering you once volunteered to test whether MREs could be used as emergency rations for a month." The laughter that followed felt natural and healing, reminding Cole of who he had been before survival became his primary identity. These people had known him as a leader, a friend, a brother, not just as a patient or a problem to be solved. As the evening progressed, the conversation moved between memories of their service together and updates on their civilian lives. Park had become a police officer in Topeka, using her military experience to train other officers in tactical response. Torres worked for a private security company, protecting corporate executives and their families. Like Cole, they had found ways to channel their military skills into civilian careers, but unlike Cole, they had maintained connections to their support networks. "The difference," Torres observed, "is that we stayed in touch with each other. When Park was dealing with PTSD, she didn't try to handle it alone. When I was struggling with the transition to civilian life, I had people to call who understood what I was going through. I didn't want to be a burden," Cole said, the familiar refrain sounding hollow even to his own ears. "You were a burden anyway," Williams pointed out gently. "Just a different kind. We spent 3 years worrying about you, wondering if you were okay, feeling guilty that we hadn't done more to stay connected. Your isolation didn't protect us from pain. It just made us feel helpless to help you." The truth of Williams' words settled over Cole like a heavy blanket. His attempt to spare others from his struggles had actually created a different kind of suffering. The pain of watching someone they cared about disappear without being able to help. At midnight, the hospital settled into the quiet rhythms of night shift routines. Cole's visitors had arranged to take turns staying with him through the night, unwilling to let him face the pre-surgical hours alone. Sarah took the first shift, settling into the reclining chair with a book she wouldn't read, her presence providing comfort that transcended conversation. "Sarah," Cole said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from her book, noting the serious tone in his voice. "When I first started working at the training facility, I thought you were just being polite when you asked about my health. I didn't realize you were actually concerned about me as a person, not just as a colleague." Sarah set down her book and moved closer to his bed. "Cole, I've been concerned about you since your first week. You moved like someone in chronic pain, but you carried yourself like someone who would never admit it. It reminded me of my brother after his motorcycle accident, too proud to acknowledge how much he was struggling." "What happened to your brother?" "He eventually learned to accept help," Sarah replied. "But it took a crisis to force the issue. Sound familiar?" Cole managed a small smile. "I'm beginning to see the pattern." They talked quietly through the early morning hours, sharing stories about their families, their career choices, and the sometimes difficult transition from military to civilian life. Sarah had served as a Navy corpsman for 6 years before pursuing additional medical training, drawn to emergency medicine by her experience treating wounded sailors. "I became a medic because I wanted to fix people," she explained. "But I learned that sometimes the best healing happens when you stop trying to fix everything and just provide support while people fix themselves." At 3 in the morning, Danny relieved Sarah, bringing coffee and the weary determination of someone who had spent hours calling family members and coordinating logistics for the extended hospital stay. Their parents were driving down from Wyoming and would arrive shortly after the surgery began. "Mom wanted to be here before you went in," Danny explained. "But I convinced her that you'd rather have her here when you wake up." Dad's bringing his prayer journal apparently. He's been praying for your leg pain for 2 years without knowing how serious it was. The revelation that his parents had been aware of his struggles, despite his efforts to hide them, shouldn't have surprised Cole. Parents possessed an intuitive understanding of their children's pain that transcended distance and careful deception. "How long have they known something was wrong?" Cole asked. "Since your first visit home after discharge," Danny replied. "Mom noticed you were limping, and Dad saw you taking pain medication when you thought no one was looking. They've been worried sick but didn't want to pressure you to talk about it." At 5 in the morning, the pre-surgical team arrived to begin final preparations. Cole's vital signs were checked, consent forms were reviewed one last time, and the anesthesia team explained their approach to managing such a complex procedure. The methodical routine felt familiar from his military experience, a careful preparation that preceded dangerous missions. Dr. Rodriguez made a final appearance before heading to the surgical suite to oversee equipment setup. "Mr. Merrick, we've assembled the best possible team for this procedure. Master Sergeant Vasquez has provided detailed analysis of both fragments, and we've rehearsed the extraction sequence multiple times. We're as prepared as we can possibly be." "Thank you," Cole said, and for the first time in 3 years, he meant it without reservation. Gratitude felt different when it came from a place of acknowledged vulnerability rather than polite obligation. At 6:30, the transport team arrived to move Cole to the surgical suite. His support network had gathered in the hallway. Danny, Sarah, Williams, Martinez, Jackson, Park, and Torres forming an honor guard of people who refused to let him face this alone. "We'll be here when you wake up," Williams promised, speaking for the group. "All of us," Martinez added with a grin, "even if it takes all day." As the gurney moved through the hospital corridors toward the surgical suite, Cole felt a profound sense of completion. The video messages on Danny's camera represented his acceptance of vulnerability and love. His unit expanded now to include family, friends, and colleagues, stood ready to support him through whatever came next. The last thing Cole saw before the anesthesia took effect was Dr. Rodriguez's confident face above him, surrounded by the surgical team that would spend the next 8 hours working to save not just his life, but his ability to walk, to work, to continue the healing journey he had finally begun. The boy who had believed that perfect preparation could prevent all loss was about to learn whether trust and surrender might be the most powerful forms of strength he had ever discovered. The surgical suite at Denver General had been transformed into something resembling a military command center, with multiple surgical teams, specialized equipment, and Master Sergeant Vasquez's bomb disposal apparatus arranged with tactical precision. Dr. Rodriguez surveyed the organized chaos with the satisfaction of a commander whose troops were ready for battle. "Teams, let's review the extraction sequence one final time," she announced to the assembled specialists. Dr. Chun's neurosurgical team will access the spinal fragment first, while Dr. Santos and I prepared the vascular approach to the femoral fragment. Coordination is critical. Any unexpected movement of either fragment could create life-threatening complications. Cole lay unconscious on the surgical table, surrounded by monitors displaying his vital signs in real-time patterns of electronic heartbeats, and breathing rhythms. The specialized surgical extraction tools equipment adapted from bomb disposal. Technology gleamed under the bright surgical lights, representing the fusion of Cole's military past with his healing future. Beginning initial incision for spinal access, Dr. Chen announced, his voice steady with the confidence of someone who had performed hundreds of similar procedures. The neurosurgical team worked with microscopic precision, exposing the area around Cole's lumbar spine, where the larger fragment had been slowly threatening his mobility for 3 years. Meanwhile, Dr. Santos prepared the vascular approach, using ultrasound guidance to map the exact position of Cole's femoral artery in relation to the metallic fragment that had triggered this medical crisis. Vasquez, can you confirm the fragment composition one more time? Military ordnance, specifically from an artillery shell casing, Vasquez replied, monitoring her equipment that would help guide the extraction process. The metallurgy suggests it's stable, no risk of chemical reaction or degradation during removal. However, the edges are sharp enough to cause significant tissue damage if we're not extremely careful. Dr. Rodriguez made the first incision in Cole's left thigh, following the surgical plan they had rehearsed multiple times throughout the night. Fragment visualization achieved. Beginning microdissection around the vascular structure. The first fragment appeared exactly as the scans had predicted, a 3-centimeter piece of jagged metal pressed against Cole's femoral artery like a sword hanging over his circulatory system. For 3 years, every heartbeat had pulsed blood past this deadly obstacle, any significant movement potentially triggering massive internal bleeding. Pulse remained steady, the anesthesiologist reported. Blood pressure stable. Patient is tolerating the procedure well. In the waiting area 4 floors above, Cole's expanded family maintained their vigil with the patience of people accustomed to uncertain outcomes. Danny paced near the windows, periodically checking his phone for updates that wouldn't come for hours. Sarah coordinated with the surgical nurse, ensuring that Cole's support network would be immediately notified of any developments. Williams sat with Martinez and Jackson, the 3 veterans sharing stories that helped pass the time while their brother underwent the fight of his life. Their conversations moved between memories of Cole's leadership in Afghanistan and observations about his struggles with civilian adjustment. You know what I realized yesterday? Jackson said, his speech still carrying the careful precision of someone who had relearned basic communication skills. Cole never let us thank him properly for pulling us out of that blast zone. Every time we tried to bring it up, he changed the subject or downplayed what he did. That's because he never believed he deserved to be thanked, Martinez replied, unconsciously adjusting his prosthetic arm. In Cole's mind, he was just doing his job. He never understood that going back for us, with his own leg torn up, that was heroism. Back in the surgical suite, Dr. Chen's team had successfully exposed the spinal fragment and begun the delicate process of separating it from surrounding nerve tissue. Fragment appears to be encased in scar tissue, which is actually helpful. It's created a protective barrier around the nerve bundles. How much longer for spinal extraction? Dr. Rodriguez asked, her attention divided between her own surgical field and the overall coordination of the dual procedure. 30 minutes, maybe 45, Dr. Chen replied. The scar tissue is dense, but is not adhered to critical structures. We should be able to remove this cleanly. Dr. Santos worked with microscopic precision around Cole's femoral artery, using specialized instruments to gradually separate the vascular fragment from surrounding tissue. This piece has definitely migrated from its original position. I can see the track it created moving through the muscle. The surgical extraction tools performed exactly as designed, allowing the medical team to manipulate the dangerous fragments without risking additional tissue damage. Vasquez monitored the procedure through specialized equipment, ready to advise if the ordnance behaved unexpectedly during removal. Beginning final extraction sequence for the vascular fragment, Dr. Rodriguez announced. All teams maintain current positions. Vasquez confirmed no complications with fragment composition. Composition remained stable, Vasquez confirmed. No signs of degradation or instability. Fragment is clear for removal. The moment of truth arrived as Dr. Rodriguez carefully lifted the metallic fragment away from Cole's femoral artery. 3 years of hidden danger finally eliminated in a single precise movement. The piece of shrapnel that had nearly killed him gleamed under the surgical light, small, sharp, and deadly in its simplicity. Vascular fragment successfully removed, Dr. Rodriguez announced. No arterial damage detected. Beginning tissue, repair, and closure. The first phase of Cole's healing was complete, but the larger challenge still lay ahead as Dr. Chen's team continued their work on the spinal fragment that had threatened his ability to walk. With the vascular fragment successfully removed, all attention turned to Dr. Chen's neurosurgical team as they approached the most dangerous phase of the procedure. The spinal fragment was larger, positioned more precariously, and surrounded by nerve tissue that controlled Cole's ability to walk. The monitors displaying Cole's neural activity had become the center of everyone's focus screens, showing brain and spinal cord function that would determine his future mobility and quality of life. Beginning microdissection around the L4-L5 nerve bundle, Dr. Chen announced, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. This fragment appears to have created significant scar tissue, but it's also pressing directly against nerve pathways. Any damage here could result in permanent motor function loss. The surgical suite fell into the focused intensity that characterized life-and-death medical procedures. Every movement was deliberate, every decision calculated against the potential for catastrophic consequences. The neural activity monitor displayed wave patterns that represented Cole's unconscious nervous system, the electrical activity that would determine whether he would walk out of the hospital or require a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Dr. Chen, we're seeing some irregular patterns on the neural monitor, the anesthesiologist reported, his voice tight with concern. Dr. Chen paused his dissection and consulted the monitor display. The wave patterns showed subtle but concerning changes that suggested the fragment manipulation was affecting nerve function. We need to modify our approach. The fragment has integrated with nerve tissue more extensively than the scans indicated. In the waiting room, Danny had stopped pacing and now sat with his head in his hands, the strain of 8 hours of uncertainty finally overwhelming his careful composure. Sarah moved to sit beside him, offering the quiet support that didn't require words. "He's going to be okay," she said softly, though her own medical training made her aware of the risks they were all trying not to discuss. Williams checked his watch and calculated the elapsed surgical time. They've been at this for 7 hours. That's longer than most combat operations. Cole always said surgery was just another kind of battle, Martinez observed. Different weapons, different objectives, but the same requirement for precision under pressure. But back in the surgical suite, Dr. Chen made a decision that would define the next phase of the procedure. "I'm going to attempt a controlled awakening. We need Mr. Merrick conscious for nerve function testing during the final extraction." The anesthesiologist began adjusting Cole's medication levels, gradually bringing him toward consciousness while maintaining enough sedation to prevent pain and panic. This technique awakening a patient during brain or spinal surgery allowed real-time assessment of neurological function, but required exceptional skill and patient cooperation. "Mr. Merrick, can you hear me?" Dr. Chen asked as Cole's eyes began to flutter open. Cole's consciousness returned slowly, the bright surgical lights and unfamiliar voices creating momentary disorientation. But his military training kicked in quickly, and he focused on Dr. Chen's face above him. "I need you to move your left foot for me," Dr. Chen instructed. "Just a small movement, flex your foot up and down." Cole concentrated on the request, sending neural signals down his spine toward his left foot. The movement was weak but present, and the surgical team watched the neural monitor display the corresponding electrical activity. Good. Now can you feel this? Dr. Chun used a specialized probe to test sensation along Cole's leg. Yes, Cole replied, his voice hoarse but clear. Feels like pressure. Dr. Chun continued the neurological assessment while simultaneously working to separate the fragment from surrounding nerve tissue. I'm going to ask you to keep moving that foot while I work. If you feel any sudden pain or if the movement becomes difficult, tell me immediately. For the next 30 minutes, Cole participated in his own surgery, providing real-time feedback about nerve function, while Dr. Chun performed microscopic dissection around the spinal fragment. The collaboration between patient and surgeon represented a level of trust that transcended normal medical relationships. Cole's life and mobility depended entirely on Dr. Chun's skill, while Dr. Chen's surgical decisions were guided by Cole's conscious responses. Fragment is beginning to separate, Dr. Chun announced. Mr. Merrick, keep that foot moving for me. Cole focused all his attention on maintaining the rhythmic movement of his left foot, each flex representing his determination to walk out of the hospital under his own power. The neural activity monitor showed steady patterns, indicating that the nerve pathways remained intact despite the surgical manipulation. Final extraction sequence initiated, Dr. Chen said, his voice tight with concentration. All teams prepare for fragment removal. The largest piece of shrapnel that had threatened Cole's mobility for 3 years was carefully lifted away from his spinal cord. The surgical instruments designed for precision bomb disposal finally completing their intended purpose. The fragment, larger and more jagged than anyone had anticipated, represented the physical manifestation of wounds that had shaped 3 years of Cole's life. Spinal fragment successfully removed, Dr. Chen announced. Neural pathways intact. Patient maintains full motor and sensory function. Cole continued flexing his foot, the simple movement now representing victory over the hidden enemy that had been slowly destroying his body. The monitor displaying his neural activity showed strong, steady patterns, the scientific measurement of hope becoming reality. Mr. Merrick, you can rest now, Dr. Chen said with evident relief. Both fragments have been successfully removed, and your neurological function appears completely intact. As the anesthesia team prepared to return Cole to full unconsciousness for the closure phase of surgery, he managed one final question. Is it over? The hard part is over, Dr. Rodriguez replied, beginning the process of closing the surgical sites. Now we just need to put you back together. 3 weeks after surgery, Cole sat in the rehabilitation center's physical therapy room, working through a series of exercises designed to restore full strength and mobility to his left leg. The incision sites had healed cleanly, leaving thin scars that would fade with time, visible reminders of the hidden battle he had finally won. Dr. Rodriguez had pronounced the surgery a complete success. Both fragments removed without complications. All nerve and vascular function preserved. Looking good, Merrick, said James Patterson, his physical therapist and a former Marine, who understood the psychological challenges of recovery as well as the physical ones. Range of motion is almost back to normal, and your strength tests are improving every session. Cole completed another set of leg raises, noting how the movement felt clean and unrestricted for the first time in 3 years. The persistent burning sensation that had been his constant companion was gone, replaced by the healthy soreness of muscles rebuilding themselves through proper exercise. Sarah entered the therapy room, carrying coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who had watched a friend overcome seemingly impossible odds. She had been present for every medical appointment and therapy session. Her professional expertise valuable, but her personal support even more important. Danny's outside with some visitors, she announced. Your former unit wants to see you demonstrate your progress. In the waiting area, Cole found not just Danny but also Williams, Martinez, Jackson, Park, and Torres. His military family gathered once again, but this time to celebrate recovery rather than provide crisis support. They had traveled to Denver, specifically for this reunion, wanting to witness Cole's return to full function. "Show us what you've got, soldier," Williams said with a grin that carried both pride and relief. Cole walked across the room with steady, confident steps, then performed a series of movements that would have been impossible just weeks earlier: deep squats, lunges, even a brief jog around the rehabilitation center's indoor track. The demonstration wasn't about showing off. It was about proving to himself and his brothers that he had fully reclaimed his physical capabilities. "Not bad for an old man," Martinez observed, his prosthetic arm moving naturally as he applauded Cole's performance. "Speak for yourself," Cole replied, but his smile carried the easy warmth that had been missing from his interactions for 3 years. The group moved to a nearby restaurant for lunch, their conversation flowing between memories of military service and updates on civilian careers. But more importantly, they talked about the future plans that included Cole in ways that had seemed impossible just months earlier. "I've been thinking about your training facility," Jackson said, his speech now carrying more confidence than it had immediately after his brain injury. "What would you think about expanding the program to include veteran rehabilitation services? Not just tactical training, but support for guys like us who are dealing with long-term injuries." Cole considered the suggestion, recognizing both the practical benefits and the personal significance. It would mean acknowledging that strength includes accepting help. "Exactly," Park replied. "You've spent 3 years teaching tactical medicine to police officers. Imagine what you could teach veterans about recognizing and treating their own hidden wounds." That evening, Cole returned to his apartment for the first time since his collapse at the training facility. The space felt different somehow, not smaller or larger, but charged with new possibilities. His tactical manual lay open on the kitchen table where he had left it, filled with annotations that now seemed like artifacts from a previous life. He picked up a pen and added a new note in the margin: "Strength includes vulnerability. Leadership includes accepting help." Danny arrived later with takeout dinner and a new photograph, a picture taken at the hospital during Cole's recovery, showing him surrounded by his support network of family, friends, and fellow veterans. The image captured something that had been missing from his life for years: genuine connection and belonging. "Mom wants to know when you're coming to Wyoming for a real visit," Danny said, settling into a chair with the easy familiarity of someone who no longer worried about his brother's health. "Soon," Cole replied, and for the first time in 3 years, he meant it without reservation. "I want to spend time with Emma and the kids. I want to be the uncle they deserve to have." "What about Sarah?" Danny asked with the directness that characterized their rebuilt relationship. Cole looked toward the kitchen where Sarah was arranging flowers she had brought from the hospital gift shop. "I'm working on that too." Turns out admitting you care about someone is another form of vulnerability. "Good thing you're getting better at that," Danny observed Dot as the evening progressed. Cole found himself completing a task he had avoided for 3 years, finishing the letter to his fallen comrade's family. The words came easily now, no longer burdened by guilt or the need to justify his survival. Instead, the letter expressed gratitude for the friendship they had shared, an acknowledgement that honoring the dead meant living fully rather than merely surviving. The letter would be mailed tomorrow, along with a donation to a veteran support organization and an invitation for the family to visit Cole's training facility when they were ready. Later that night, Cole stood in his bedroom, looking at the small wooden box that contained his Purple Heart. For 3 years, the medal had remained hidden, a symbol of honor he felt unworthy to display. But tonight, he placed it on his dresser where the morning light would catch the ribbon, not as a monument to his military service, but as a reminder that survival could be transformed into purpose. His phone buzzed with a text from Williams. Asterisk unit photo tomorrow at the training facility. Everyone who's in Denver. Time to update the official record. Cole smiled and typed back. Roger that. See you at 0800 asterisk. The new unit photo would include not just his military brothers, but also Sarah, Danny, and the colleagues from his training facility who had become his extended family. It would represent his expanded definition of brotherhood and belonging, a community built not on shared trauma, but on mutual support and genuine care. As Cole settled into bed that night, the absence of pain in his left leg felt like a small miracle. But the greater miracle was the absence of the emotional numbness that had characterized his existence for 3 years. He felt fully present in his own life for the first time since his discharge, ready to build a future that honored both his service and his survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, surrounded by evidence of love and support, Cole Merrick finally understood that true strength wasn't about enduring pain alone. It was about having the courage to heal in the company of people who refused to let him face his battles in isolation. The wounded soldier had become a healing man, and his story was just beginning.